Welcome everybody. This is our first EOcafe after the summer, so I hope everybody had a great summer, has stayed well. I hope everybody managed to get some holiday, unlike myself, and despite my change of status, but that was unfortunate. It was a particular story. This is the first of the new season of EOcafe. As you recall, we'll offer an EOcafe, invite you all to join an EOcafe every 2 weeks, and we'll have a very interesting set of topics to put before you in the next few weeks. But today, I'm very pleased to say that we have the OCRE team with us. It's a very practical webinar today, a very practical discussion in the cafe. I'll not say much about OCRE because our hosts will say more about that, and will explain about OCRE and what it's doing. But I can say that OCRE, I think, stems from a discussion that we had some years ago with Augusto Borgueno in the Commission. And it led to what I consider is a very innovative and stimulating approach to helping to build EO services and build a market for EO services, particularly building on two key European programs, that is the European Open Science Cloud and Copernicus. So before I start the presentations, just first rules, please, microphones off. Normally we have videos on if people wish, but today it doesn't allow or doesn't provide for videos, so we'll stay sightless. When it comes to questions, please put them into the chat. It's easier for us to monitor the chat. You can raise your hand if you wish, but it's not certain that we'll see that. So please put your question in the chat. And if we come to your question, then I'll give you the floor to ask it. So without any further ado, let's turn to our first speaker. Kicking off is David Haynes. David is the OCRE project coordinator working for the lead of OCRE, which is Jean. David, the floor is yours. You need to put your microphone on.
Yeah, can you all see my screen?
I think you need to go to full screen mode. That's better.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, cool. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for your interest in the project. I'm the project director, and I realize that we are focusing on Earth observations this afternoon and the Earth observations market. But I'm going to give you a quick overview of the OCRE project, and then my colleagues will speak more specifically to procurement and the Earth observation procurements, and then our funding initiatives, and also focused on the Earth observation research community, or the research community that consumes Earth observation services. So in a nutshell, why the OCRE project? So Europe is the largest producer of research data in the world, and the European Commission wants to increase the use of this data. And obviously today we'll be focusing on the Copernicus data. But what we intend to do is provide researchers with easy access to commercial cloud and digital services focused on the Earth observation, Earth observations. And to do this, we are going to set up some significant procurements, and then actually make access to these services through these procurements as easy as possible with all the right support mechanisms in place. And then to drive the adoption of these services through a series of funding waves. And I'll get into a little bit more detail on this, but as I say, I'm going to speak at a fairly high level and not steal my colleagues' thunder. And also, as this is just a project overview, I'll kind of keep it fairly brief. So why do we want to make these digital services easily available? We want to promote agility in local research activities, and provide for a number of different kinds of services to support research activities. We want to support collaboration. We want to drive the broader European Open Science Cloud ambitions of open research, the hosting of fair data for future research, and then the stimulation of the small and medium kind of enterprises. And then sustainability. We want to stimulate the European digital economy, and this afternoon we'll be focusing on the digital economy using the Earth observation data. To grow the emerging Earth observation digital solutions, we realize that you are still a fairly immature market, certainly compared to our large commodity cloud procurements, and then to provide for acquisition and service discovery. And in doing this, we'll onboard all of these services onto the EARSC Hub catalogs. We will host them ourselves on the Géant catalogs. The NRENs will host them on the in-country catalogs. So that's essentially what we're hoping to do. The key benefits for the research community will be that these services are validated, that they meet the community needs. We've done extensive requirements analysis, that they check boxes in terms of data privacy, GDPR, contracting, billing integration, technical support, pricing, all of those focused, or a subset of those focuses, that they integrate with the European Open Cloud, again, initially through the catalogs, that they are ready to use agreements in place with the suppliers so that the individual institutes don't have to run their own tenders, their own competitions, that they can actually consume through these frameworks and procurement structures. That the researchers can apply for EC adoption funds to allow them to start using these services and adopt these services and experiment with these services. And then there is a discipline-focused proof of concept in terms of Earth observation services. Right, just a quick look at what the cloud procurement looks like. So commodity cloud is a very, very mature market. What we are building is a great big 4-year framework. In each country across the 40 participant countries in Europe, we are setting up frameworks with a number of suppliers. There will be a single supplier of services for each of the original cloud platform, original infrastructure platforms, and that includes resellers of the hyperscale platforms. Géant, as a centralized procurement body, will be able to procure across all of these lots, but the national research and education networks will be able to procure in each of the lots in their countries, as will all of their institutes in support of the researchers. So that's the cloud procurement in a nutshell. The Earth observation procurement is very different, and Olaf will be speaking about this, but essentially it will be in the form of a dynamic procurement system that will allow suppliers to register on the DPS throughout the life of the DPS. And we're hoping to stimulate these registrations by funding research projects that will be consuming Earth observation data, and allow them to define their specific requirements and allow yourselves as the market to respond to these. The impact targets for these projects that we will be funding need to be research projects that intend on consuming digital services to accelerate their research outcomes, that are able to demonstrate the impact of these services in terms of their outputs, that are not currently using these tools at scale, that provide significant relevance in terms of their research disciplines, that form part of the broader European research community, that hope to support further research and collaboration through their efforts in their various research disciplines. The timing of the projects is obviously needs to kind of map to the timing of our project, OCRE. And we are looking for these projects to identify opportunities for the promotion of hosting reusable research data for future projects. And the reason we have these impact targets is that we would like to leave a legacy of case studies, of research projects that have consumed these services and clearly demonstrated the impacts of these services. And those case studies will be a legacy that we leave behind as a project. There are a couple of funding initiatives. We are providing vouchers for individual researchers. We are instituting a number of calls for institutional projects and collaboration projects, co-funding for biogroups. The calls, the first of the cloud calls will be published on the 15th of this month, but the first of the Earth observation calls, which is more relevant to you guys, will be published actually on October the 14th. It will focus on project submissions by individual institutes, the second wave of our funding initiatives. These projects will need to meet the impact targets as described 2 slides ago. They will need to require digital services consuming Copernicus data. They need to be able to clearly describe these services or their requirements for these services in support of publication, so that through the DPS, we can kind of reach out to the market with specific requirements in terms of these projects. OCRE has an external advisory board who help us verify our impact targets. They also help us provide transparency over our funding initiatives, and they sign off on the projects that we elect to fund in terms of the kind of case studies that they can produce. These calls will be socialized across all channels available to the OCRE project. ESA, for example, have offered to kind of socialize these opportunities. And the first call will exclude opportunities for biogroups and just focus on the projects submitted by the individual institutes. Jount and the NRENs, our responsibility in this landscape will be to catalog these services, to help broker relationships between the market and the research institutes, to provide support for any procurement, certainly in terms of what the OCRE project is funding, but beyond that, procurements off of this dynamic procurement system will be supported by Jount and the NRENs. We have local cloud forums, which the market is welcome to attend to present on their services. We will procure on behalf of the research and education community, where we are listed as underwriters or biogroups, as national research and education networks. The NRENs will help evangelize the services at their national conferences that they hold annually. They will host webinars, and they will allow the suppliers or encourage the suppliers to describe their services and get their services out there. They will communicate funding calls for institutes. They will work with their institutes on these opportunities, and they will also provide support for local buyer groups and lead buyers that represent research projects. Our external advisory board is fairly representative across the European research community. And as you'll see there are a number of folk that actually represent the research community that consume Earth observation services. So they're in place, they assist us, we assemble them whenever we run a call, and they help us a great deal. That's all I have to present on. As I said, on the procurement and the funding opportunities for research institutes, Olaf and Jan are coming up. And we look forward to a Q&A session after the presentations. So please, if you have any questions on this presentation, you can start getting them into the chat and those will be facilitated after the presentations.
Great, thanks, David. We're starting to get some questions coming through, but I shall hold all questions to the end. So we'll go through all the presentations and then have questions after Jan has spoken. So the next speaker is Olaf Verschoor also from Géant. Géant is the procurement specialist. I have to say we've had a number of discussions about the procurement on OCRE, and I certainly didn't realise it was so complex. So Olaf, please help everyone understand, and good luck.
Well, thanks. I will try to make it as light as possible and to only stipulate the points which make sense now. Yes, right. Full screen. Yes, my name is Olaf Schoor, and I'm a procurement specialist at Géant, dealing with the OCRE project. And as David described, we are going to set up a DPS for Earth observation services, and I would like to explain what a DPS is, what it does, and well, how you can relate to that. The first bit is not a relay of what David says, but I want to highlight some of the main differences between cloud services and Earth observation, and why we've come to the conclusion that we should make a DPS instead of, let's say, a more traditional tender. Because if you look at let's say the different market of Earth observation and cloud professional cloud services, you see a few main differences there, and David already mentioned that the cloud services are much more a commodity type of service, whereas on the Earth observations there are much larger variations in the type of services and products offered, also sometimes very niche kind of services. Also, the whole professional cloud services are dominated by a few large organizations, often reselling via reseller networks, and an X number of smaller platforms, but still, in comparison to many of the Earth observation of companies specialized in Earth observations, they tend to be a bit smaller. There are much more SMEs and even startups there. And last but not least, the cloud services is a much more mature and established market. And if you look at the Earth observation market, again, that is much more varied. Some aspects of the market are developed and mature, but other markets are much more immature. So these are from a procurement perspective very important factors on how we are engaging with the markets. And I come back to the decision of making a DPS and what does it mean in the next slides. I also want to stipulate the two following. In OCRE, we are not making a choice for a certain supplier or a certain technology, because that choice is to be made by the researcher or the institutes using that services. We simply does not have not enough know-how to make such a decision on behalf of a researcher, which can have already bespoke or really specific requirements. What OCRE does is facilitating a supply and demand between the R&E community and the market, drive adoption, as Dave said, of EO services, whether or not supported by EC funds, and for the markets to actually have access to projects made by the R&E community. Again, in the short timeline, again, what the main objectives were for us on the procurement side. Again, we want to stimulate the use and awareness of EO products, cloud service products in the R&E community, and basically to accelerate scientific output. And that scientific output should not be hindered by capacity or other technical barriers, or the size of a hard drive, etc. Because if you move it to the cloud, well, in theory, the resources are unlimited. It's also very important to state that by doing so, we are stimulating the European Earth observation industry by trying to accelerate demand. And that is actually where also these funding is used for. And last but not least is to stimulate the use of Copernicus data and have a sustainable use for them. Well, as I said, we looked for a dynamic purchasing system, and it's also maybe headed as a formal procedure as described in the European Procurement Directive. And there are a few points which are critical for our decision to use that DPS instead of a more traditional framework. And that partly ties down partly is connected with the differences in the market I mentioned in my first sheet. So a very important requirement is that because of the markets of the Earth observation companies, they tend to be new companies appearing all the time, smaller smaller startups who found a very discovered or developed a clever algorithm or new products developed. So we want to stimulate those companies. But if we would do a normal procurement, we basically hold a procurement, and that tender procedure is stopped at a certain point in time, and then frameworks are agreement, and then basically the door is closed for 4 years. While if a DPS, new companies can continue to apply for access to a, let's say, preferred supplier list, so they can enter the DPS throughout time. Basically, there's no limit in there. There's also no limit on the number of suppliers, whereas a traditional framework has always been a limit to 2, 3, 4, 5 suppliers. And if while we're setting up a DPS, and the tenders in that DPS will be accessible for all the suppliers admitted to that to the DPS, where in a traditional framework the tenders or mini competitions are only accessible for framework holders. So it is impossible for new companies to enter that. Entering the DPS is a relatively light process. We're going to ask you a few things. We're going to ask you to fill out the compulsory ESPD form, the European form, in which we check whether if you're not bankrupt or sentenced because of bribery and those kind of things. And we ask you to agree to our standard terms and conditions and process. And if these boxes are all checked, you are admitted to the DPS, which is a much lighter and a less time costly process than a regular tender process. And also, because we do not know at this stage what exactly the tenders in the DPS will look like, because they are dependent on the open calls. It is easier for us to target specific to match our DPS tenders to the requirements of that research project which is chosen. Whereas a standard framework agreement, we have to make a scope and adhere to that scope throughout the lifetime of those frameworks, which can hinder us when a complete different type of project is chosen. Well, what is it going to look like when we actually publish a DPS, and what is required for, of any of the entities that are willing to participate? So at a point in time, and that point in time will be roughly between now and, well, mid-October, we are aiming at, we will publish the DPS. And the publishing of DPS is, well, equal to any other European tender. So we will make a publication on the via TED and the Dutch procurement sites, because JANT is a Dutch association, so therefore we are bound by Dutch procurement legislation. JANT will make that publication as a centralized purchasing body, so we are doing that on behalf of all participants, and those participants will also be listed in that OG notice. After the publication, and now at step 2, a installation period of 30 days will start, and during those 30 days, interested parties can send in a request to be admitted to the DPS, and what we will publish on day 1 is a scope description, which in this case will be very broad. It will be something in the terms as we are looking for companies who are able to offer us services and products in the Earth observation sphere, and by minimum you have to be able to do something with Copernicus data. And I don't think that the scope description will be more tight than that. We will publish the ESPD because that is a compulsory element of of setting up a DPS. We will explain in detail how the process looks like, and we will publish our contracts and T's and C's. And during that 30 days of installation periods, parties have, like in all other tenders, you have the opportunity to ask us questions. You can suggest any alterings to be made to the agreements or T's and C's, just like a normal tender. And after we have summarized all the questions and our answer in the information notice, all those public documents, including maybe some amendment based on the questions we received, all these documents will become final. And after the deadline, 30 days after a publication, we are going to evaluate the request to be admitted, and basically we are just going to check the boxes, because that nothing we ask you yes or no to agree. So we will check if all the boxes are in the box yes, and if that's the case, the people will be admitted to the DPS. Unlike a normal tender, after those initial 30 days, it is still possible to be admitted to the DPS. And the main difference is that if you choose to request access after the 30 days, it's not possible to ask any questions anymore. Well, we still are able to ask a question, but we are not able to change the final documents anymore, because in the first 30 days we have some room to amend our contracts and to amend the T's and C's, but after 30 days they will close, and because we have asked all the parties to agree to our terms and conditions, agree to the scope, it will be unfair to other entities who only request, let's say, admittance on day 60 or on day 180 to deviate from those terms and conditions. So after 30 days, we are able actually to start tendering, and it will be unlikely though that we will have a tender directly after the 30 days, because the first DPS tender is anticipated after the first open call of projects. But we are able to start executing tenders after the first 30 days. A DPS tender is only accessible for admitted parties. So if a company is not part of the DPS and a DPS tender is raised, and you suddenly realize, oh, this was my chance of getting on the roster, basically you are too late. You can still enter the DPS, but you would not have access to tender which is in progress at that time. You just have to wait for the next tender to come up. DPS tenders are only visible to parties in the DPS. So unlike a open tender where we have the obligation to publish on TED or wherever, DPS tenders will not be published on TED. They will only become visible to the parties in the DPS. DPS tenders have a minimum response time of 10 days. We are allowed to make them longer. So if we have a more, let's say, complicated tender, we will take more than 10 days, but the minimum response time is 10 days. Obviously, we will make mention of the requirements and use specifications if we publish a DPS tender. And there are only limited possibilities to negotiate on agreements. As I said in step 2, you must agree to our terms and conditions and agree to our agreements. So we have not much room to deviate on that if we in the third step 3 are actually publishing a DPS tender. We are able to make some amendments when they are related to the scope of work, but we have limited possibility to change other legal elements. And what we are scoring and what we will be evaluating, those criteria will be mentioned in the DPS tender. Well, step 4 is when we received proposals based on DPS tenders. We will score, evaluate proposals, and obviously those results will be communicated to all applicable parties, just like in a normal tender. And we have also an obligation to publicly, so not only towards the DPS parties, but to the whole market, basically, to periodically publish the work we have tendered via the DPS, and we are obliged to make public the entities to whom we awarded work. I think personally that we will do so every once in the 6 months, but it depends a little on how many tenders we are putting through our DPS. Well, that is in a very short bird's eye overview what a DPS is and how the process looks like. And as Jeff said and Dave said, we at the end of this presentation, you are free to ask any questions on this.
Thanks, Olaf. I think that was very clear. But if people have questions, please put them into the chat. There's one comment from Christoph Weiss, which hopefully will be answered in the next presentation. But Christoph, if it isn't, then please feel free to come back and ask later. So the next presentation is from Jose Manuel Delgado Biosco. Jose Manuel is EA expert for OCRE, and during his other work works for the REA group. Jose Manuel, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So hello everybody, my name, as Jeff already introduced, is Jose Manuel Delgado Blasco. I'm an association expert, and we run the requirements gathering during the first phase of the project. So how do you got these things? Okay, sorry, I'm sharing a bit of everything here, I guess. So we got good participation in the requirements gathering, that it was involving 19 countries, and they were represented all the thematic domains in the EARSC taxonomy. So that for us ensure that there was a good participation in which we had a good overview of what the researchers are looking for, the services to be provided. So we identified 6 technical capabilities: data processing services, user arguing, hosting, data analytics, interactive developments, value-added products, and also data sharing and publishing. That's also depending a lot in which are the researches that were asked for. So I will try to make some examples of what could be kind of the services, or what are the examples of the users that we expect them to to participate here. So examples of the presentation applications. So could be asked like produce a NDVI map, for example. It will be the easiest kind of request a user or customer researcher could ask for, but they could be more complicated ones. They want stack of products, value-added products, or going further than that, they want a time series analysis of these products in which they can identify different type of crops, or that they help them to identify anomalies in the harvest period or whatever other thing. So they can extract time series analysis, statistics, provide change detection in crop mapping and so on. Or they can even go next step in which these maps were used and to classify different type of crops. So then they can be asked land cover maps or multi-temporal land cover maps or even land cover chains. Depends a lot, as I said, which is the researcher. So just listing a bit of application that came to my mind just with a simple NDVI time series. There could be analysis of the healthy vegetation or a time series analysis of these crops. They want to analyze the crop season, or they want to identify the crops. They want to produce land cover mapping. They want to analyze the food production of a country, or calculate the crop yield or the soil erosion, or even derived products of this could be also change the calculate the relationship with the evapotranspiration, or even this evapotranspiration going further on that and trying to go to climate change studies. So just some examples of the customer scenarios that we foresee, but they are not the only ones, just some examples of them. So it could be, sorry, it would need help to remove this. And as you see, the on top bar as well, right? So the non-EO or traditional EO customer. So there's a customer on one side, provider, and we have the Earth that is being observed by the satellite. So then the provider can send the request, the customer can send the request to the provider. The provider has a in-house list of services, is only not exhausting one, as I said. And then they produce what the customer requested and they send the results to him. So that is the traditional scenario. Then we are now in a period that everything is going to cloud. There are processing platforms being created, services being online. So we have again the Earth being monitored by satellites, but this time the customer connects to the provider's processing platform through a laptop, and is himself the one that is creating the maps with the services that are there already available in the platform, right? So you can create the same thing: one map, stack of maps, time series, or mappings. Then obviously there are sets of services that they could be there, like regeneration of value-added products, could be also the same thing, eh? Data time series analysis, analytics, classification, data sharing, systematic production. That they have not to be different services than the traditional ones. They could be as well, but in this time there is the customer that is the one connected to the platform and running the jobs and getting the results himself. Or even we have another example. This is the new generation expert customer, I call it. We have again the Earth being monitored, the customer that connects to the provider processing platform, and then he is developing the algorithm. So he's not using this time the already available services, he's creating the ones. And then once he created, maybe he wants also this algorithm to be in cost by this provider and to be also shared with the community. So there's this kind of scenarios that we foresee that could be requested through OCRE. So that was our short overview, but time is running and we are expecting you to have time for questions so we can reply them. So thanks. In case that you have any question and maybe we could not reply, you have here the emails that we can, you can send an email and we will try to reply all of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose Manuel. That was great, and thank you for being quick. So now very quickly turn to the last speaker, which is Jan Meyer from Uninet. Jan is the OCRE task leader in Uninet. Jan, the floor is yours. Jan, maybe you need to unmute.
The system warned me about that, and that I couldn't find the unmute button. So thanks, Jeff. As Jeff mentioned, my name is Jan Meyer. I work for Uninet, the Norwegian NREN. And as you can clearly see, I'm happy to be in the EOcafe. Thanks for having us. So OCRE's objectives: once services portfolio has been established, adoption funding will then be used to target the research community to stimulate the adoption of those services. And through executing these two activities, OCRE contributes to the capability in EOSC for procuring and brokering commercial services. I wanted to mention that because it indicates that there's a long-term horizon with this activity. I'll focus on number 2, the adoption funding. So there is roughly 9.5 million euros in adoption funding available in OCRE. And
Jan, I'm sorry for interrupting you, but you need to share the other screen. Thank you.
You're not seeing anything?
No, we're seeing an offset front page, I would say, of your presentation. I think you need to go to full screen, and that's better. That's it.
That's better. Okay. So I won't bother going back to the previous one. OCRE has roughly 9.5 million euros available in adoption funding, which is divided equally between the two service types. So the chunk that is most relevant for this community is that one allocated to Earth observation services. We're developing a plan for the wave 1, targeting Earth observation individual researchers. Here I'll focus on what we have as a plan for wave 2 and 3. So the wave 2 focuses on research projects at individual institutions. The wave 3 focuses at research projects at groups of institutions represented by a lead organization. And this could be NRENs, that lead organization. It could be groups of universities with shared services. It could be shared services infrastructures, various groups. Important to point out, in wave 3, we expect whoever applies for a project to rock up with 50% of the funding themselves. And that's 50% of the funding for the service consumption, because if you look at the practical constraints that we have for what can the adoption funding be used for, they're meant for research use of the services that you can procure. So they're explicitly not meant for the project's person hours. Those they have to find funding for themselves. And our assumption is that we'll attract projects that have already been defined and that can use the OCRE services to either execute their project in a cheaper way and use that budget on something else, or to achieve some result that they couldn't achieve before. The services have to be available on the OCRE procurement vehicles, and they're available for institutions who are eligible to procure from the OCRE procurement vehicles. But in practice, that is nearly every research institution in the green countries. Now, important to point out, Olaf mentioned that, what is available through the OCRE procurement vehicle is dynamic with a DPS procurement. So a couple of words about the strategy and the targeted impact that we've set for the adoption funding. As Dave mentioned, we're aiming for bigger flagship projects that can act as showcases for what can be achieved using OCRE services. So what we're after is research relevant projects. So we're not looking for the number 1,000 of a particular thing. We're looking for something that is eye-catching, and you know it when you see it, but it's a bit hard to describe in an award criteria. We're looking for eye-catching research relevant projects that really show how OCRE's portfolio service can help researchers achieve great research outcomes. And this could be new outcomes enabled by services. It could be improved execution. It could be saving time or money. It could be an improvement in quality. We're figuring that there ought to be a possibility for an impact amplifier. Service use should allow nimble groups to do large undertakings before we're beholden to larger institutions. It ought to allow for nimble budgets to achieve great things, because you can just rent the infrastructure that you need rather than establishing it yourself. From our point of view, that should then result in a direct adoption at a limited number of institutions. it should primarily result in inspiring showcases, showcases that really inspire other researchers to adopt services for their research. And this applies for both the cloud services and the Earth observation services. In the wave 3, we're hoping for an additional impact. Like I said, we're hoping that we'll see groups of institutions that have more permanent collaboration relationships, especially on service delivery, that they would apply. And that then ought to lead to the establishment of these lead applicants as kind of like permanent adoption amplifiers. And that would be a really good outcome, because then that service that they acquired would become part of that permanent group portfolio. And that's a great starting point for continued service consumption. A quick look at the process, and I think that'll answer 2 of the questions that were asked. If I switch on this mouse pointer, can you now see a laser pointer? Can someone in the panel nod? You're seeing it, right?
Yes.
Right. So this is the entire workflow that we've sketched for the wave 2 and 3 funding. A call is prepared with the help of this external advisory board who advises on where to target the call, which discipline, geography, type of service, if we desire to do so. The first call is a very wide call. There's no limits of that sort. Once the call is opened, some institution will submit a project proposal, which once the call closes, the proposals are evaluated and awarded. Out pops 1 or more selected projects. And I think this is the point where I'm going to hopefully answer 2 of the questions. Once a project has been selected, the OCRE team will, together with the applicant, so the applying institution, will specify the functional requirements for the required services for that particular project. Using those functional requirements, a DPS tender will then be conducted, which results in a single supplier for that particular project. For the sake of brevity in the diagram, I'm mentioning single supplier. If we're going to need multiple suppliers to satisfy the functional requirements, then obviously that's going to be the outcome. Service delivery is then done to the project execution. The project is executed by the institution. OCRE is not involved in that, but naturally we're monitoring progress, and it's OCRE's responsibility to use the research outcome and what's been done in the project and create that fantastic, inspiring showcase. The payment is then arranged through the OCRE adoption funds, and I shall not be getting into the mechanics of that at this point. Again, important to point out, Olaf mentioned it before, the Earth observation services are a dynamic purchasing system where you as a supplier can join up to the point where the DPS tender is executed. So that means that as long as we're here, you can still join. By the time we're executing here, you're too late. That then means that you have to keep an eye on the timetable. So as Dave mentioned, the first Earth observation services call will open on the 14th of October with a webinar. It'll close 6 weeks later. And if you then look at the overall OCRE timetable, I shall not go through all details, but I've highlighted the important points for you. So 14th of October, the first call opens. The important moment for you to keep an eye on is when we make our award decisions, because that's when the clock starts ticking. That's when we start to prepare for that first DPS tender. Second EO calls is planned to open on the 15th of February, with award decisions early May. And that means that the DPS tender can be expected before summer holidays. The third and last calls will open before summer holidays, with the award decisions made in September, which means that the DPS tender can be expected around, I guess, end of October, early November. And thank you, and see you at the first OCRE Earth observation call opening webinar on the 14th of October.
Thanks, Jan. I was also going to highlight that there is the webinar on the 14th of October, and the service providers are equally interested to attend that and to hear what this discussion. So now we've had a few questions, so I'm going to turn straight to the floor. I'll turn first to Lucy Kennedy. You had a couple of questions there. Your second one may already have been answered, but I'll give the floor to you to answer to ask your questions. Hello, Lucy. Yeah.
Now, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
You're a bit faint, but so if you could speak up, but we can hear you.
Is that better?
That's better, much better.
If I eat the microphone, it all works well. So thanks very much for the presentation. My company Spotted, we sit in the UK. So what is the situation with OCRE, depending on whether we Brexit deal or no deal at the end of the year?
So, yeah.
Olaf?
I was going to say Olaf.
It's a bit, I don't have a glass ball, but it should not have such a great impact, I assume. And maybe there would be some, I don't know, some VAT issues or some issues which has to deal with customs if it's a physical product, but besides that, I do not really see any issues, to be honest.
Okay, all right. I have a legal entity in Poland as well, in case, but.
Lucy, and I think just from our understanding from the European Commission is that for the moment anyway, the UK institutes are still eligible for funding, and then as Olaf was saying, there might be some cross-country procurement issues, but the laws, our procurements are starting to shift to the laws of Ireland, referencing the laws of Ireland. I mean, that's just a technicality.
Okay.
It doesn't make much difference.
All right. And my second question was about Wave 1 funding. So we talked about Wave 2 and Wave 3, but somehow I missed or didn't understand Wave 1.
So Wave 1 is voucher funding, and it's focused on individual researchers. And what we did last year was we bought some commodity cloud vouchers off of an existing framework and offered them to researchers that had helped us with some of the requirements gathering. But the bigger part of Wave 1 is the procurement of vouchers off of the OCRE cloud framework, and then certainly suppliers on the DPS. And that is still being workshopped because we really need these procurements to be in place, and we need to have an understanding of who the suppliers are on these procurements and whether or not they could in fact process voucher funding of individual researchers. So we will be socializing opportunities for both the research community and the market to join us on Wave 1 Part 2 when we get there. So we will maybe kind of approach you guys through this kind of a forum or kind of reach out through our comms channels, but we will speak to Wave 1 once
so we have to watch this space then.
Yeah, pretty much.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks Lucy and David. So next, then maybe I turn to Emmanuel Mondon. You had a couple of questions in there which are quite linked. So Emmanuel, if you can, your floor's yours.
Yes, good afternoon. Thanks for picking up my question. Do you hear me?
If you could be a bit closer to the mic, it would help.
Do you hear me better?
That's better.
One question regarding the DPS, which is new for me. It's always great learning new things. Have you already handled such DPS, Géant or whomever within the
Well, yeah, Géant has one other DPS, something for connectivity. So basically what we are tendering there is black fiber and connections related to a network. And in previous lives, I had a DPS for the procurement of trees, which we plant in parks, etc. And DPS for professional services. So yes, there is experience with it. But to be frank, we have no experience in a DPS for Earth observations. And to my knowledge, this does not exist. And So therefore, it's also for us a bit of a trial and error. And we made the decision based on the characteristics of the market, and as we are when we will be publishing this DPS, we will also stipulate that this is also a trial for us, or a trial anyway, and that the DPS will definitely remain open throughout the lifetime of OCRE. But that we also have an option there to extend the DPS beyond the lifetime of OCRE, or maybe stop the DPS, make any amendments based on the lessons learned, and reopen the DPS. So that is the best answer I can I have on that.
Thanks. A follow-up one related to the procurement model. You were mentioning at the beginning, David, 40 NREN, but that's only for the infrastructure part. It's not related to the EU services part, right?
Yeah, it's not related to the EO services part, although we are going to be using the national research and education networks in those countries to help socialize opportunities into the research community. And you know, you may well be interacting with your national research and education networks in the various countries as suppliers.
Yeah,
Okay.
maybe to add on that. So I'm not sure from which perspective you are asking this question, but on the cloud tender, there is let's say there are 40 different, the cloud tender is divided into 40 different lots, and every lot representing one country. That will not be the case in the Earth observation tender. The Earth observation will be just one tender or one lot, or however you want to call it, without the division into 40 lots. It will just be one tender only.
Great news, because I'm having I'm coming from the data provider perspective.
Yeah. No, this is going to be much easier, not only for you, also for us, because
yeah.
for us 40 lots is also an enormous amount of work. Yeah.
And then my second topic was more related to DIAS, because it's still unclear for me. So DIAS means Copernicus Data and Information Access Service. There are 4 DIASes right now. And in your slides, you were mentioning use Copernicus data as a trigger, but then DIAS in one slide of Jose, I think, was mentioned. So to make it clear, I can provide a service using Copernicus data, but not running on DIAS. Or I could provide a service running on DIAS, but not leveraging Copernicus data. Or I could do both, providing a service running on DIAS, leveraging Copernicus data. So I think it will be very important for all of us to make it clear what are the prerequisites. Because 2 years ago, the prerequisite was pretty clear. DIAS was, where, is, are mandatory. Is it still the case?
So I think the mandatory requirement is to consume Copernicus data from the Sentinels. We are trying to, I think one of the European Commission's intentions is to stimulate consumption off of the DIAS, but I don't think we can make that a mandatory requirement, because obviously you can consume Copernicus you know, from various different platforms, and also the researchers will essentially be consuming the Copernicus data through suppliers like yourself. And these services are going to be kind of almost hybridized over, you know, your kinds of services, commodity cloud services. So while the project is trying to stimulate the use of consumption off of the DIAS platforms, I don't think it will be mandatory, although Copernicus will.
Thank you, very clear. Thanks. That's all my side.
Thanks, Emmanuel. So there's one further question. Well, no, it's disappeared now. Giovanni had a question, but about the about the list of suppliers, but I think that's been answered.
Yeah,
but
I answered that one, Jeff. Basically, the question is if I did it correctly, if there was a list of entities that can propose a project, and I answered that it's an open call. So basically, everyone inside the R&E community can send in a proposal.
But are the boundaries to that? I mean, do they have to be affiliated to a university or a research institute? What defines whether it's a research or a non-research activity?
You answer that, Jan?
The assumption that I've so far carried, but to be honest, also my understanding of the dynamic purchasing system is something that needs to be built up. So for the cloud procurement, we have a very clear definition of that community. It's any institution that is a member of any of the NRENs participating in that procurement. And that effectively means you cover close to 100% of publicly funded research and education institutions in 39 countries. So that's universities, that's all relevant research institutions, as long as they're public. It doesn't cover private institutions. It covers a lot of the foundations. It covers a good chunk of government, but that depends on the country. Now, my assumption was that for the Earth observation funding call, that we'd have a similar requirement and a similar community definition.
Mm-hmm. So a researcher in a company would not be able to apply?
Unless that company would be a member of that particular NREN. Okay. And there are examples of that.
Okay. Okay.
Also, I think our funding calls will be pretty explicit on this. We are waiting for some information back from the European Commission in terms of funding eligibility, because as a project through the consortium partners, we need to claim costs against the project from the Commission, and we need to fund projects that drive our project's ambitions. So that will be made clearer in the actual funding calls.
And that's a very good point, Dave, because we basically have two routes to achieve that. And one of those two routes, we need to apply in about half of the countries. And that does involve the local national research and educational network. So that organizational link needs to be there. Otherwise, we can't do what we intend to do.
Okay. Thanks. If there are any more questions, there's one. But I was just going to observe, I mean, we've discussed that there will be evolving priorities on the requirements. Firstly, because they may become, there may be some areas which are mandatory and those which are then become optional or desirable from a supplier. But also, in order to meet the goals of the Commission and the overall project, you may want to refocus calls in order to better meet the objectives of the Commission. If the first call goes all towards one type of service, then you may want to rebalance a different way. Yep. So there is a dynamism within the dynamic procurement process as well.
Yeah, and also in the adoption funding process, which we've explicitly designed so that we can have a scoping per individual call. And that means that we can adapt the scope of call number 2 to the experiences from call number 1, but also to the dynamics that we're observing in both the supplier and the user community. And obviously to the signals that we're getting from the European Commission.
Okay, good. We'll take one last question. Christoph Weiss has put another question in there about monitoring of deformation of bridges. This is a subject I've looked at a little bit recently. Christoph.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for giving me the floor. I'm working with the Procurement and Research Institute here in Belgium, who is quite keen to measure and monitor the structure of the health of bridges. And I was wondering, is this a possible project that could be introduced in the framework of the calls?
So I would be very interested to hear from the suppliers of these services as to whether or not that would be the kind of project that they could actually respond to. You know, so certainly from a funding perspective, if that was a project that the market could respond to in terms of developing services, we would certainly consider funding it.
Well, I think it's very much a topic of research and could certainly be met from the supplier side. The question would mostly lie around the resolution of Sentinel data, Copernicus data, but research would certainly be interested to look at that, and depending on the magnitude of the reflection, could be effective.
And there again, it would be on the scale of 50% funding coming from the institution, and eventually then it would be funded 50% from the European Commission.
Depends on which call you apply, that project would apply for. So the call that opens on the 14th of October, that is a call that targets individual institutions, and the service consumption there is intended to be funded 100%. The two subsequent calls, so the one that opens in February next year and the one that opens in July next year, those will be a combination of wave 2 and wave 3. So again, the wave 2 is the 100% funded service consumption for projects from individual institutions. The wave 3 is that 50% co-funded by groups of institutions.
Okay, then make it clear. Thank you.
Yep. And just to throw in my 2 cents on the eye-opening aspect, I'm just thinking of the sheer amount of bridges that we have in Europe and the disasters that we've seen over the last couple of years. I'm like, well, from a society point of view, that sounds interesting.
That's for sure.
We've been looking at that just recently, but that raises another question in my mind: is there a limit for the consumption of the services? If it's for a European project, then the European project may take some time to get off the ground. You know, so is there a limit for the consumption of the data that's the service that's purchased through OCRE?
A time limit.
Yeah. So basically, the OCRE project runs through the end of 2021, and we will be applying for an extension based on the COVID time. And it's not really necessarily based on COVID, but what we'd like to do is have projects that we're able to help us towards the end of 2021 actually start building these case studies and reporting on the benefits of consuming these services. So the OCRE project doesn't go on for too long. So we are kind of looking to fund projects that will be kicking off at some point next year, and certainly that would be able to provide really interesting feedback to the project before the project does end, which is now looking to be the middle of 2022.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think at that point we should finish. Just to clarify for Emmanuel, yes, the 14th of October is the call for the consumers, for the researchers looking to put in applications into OCRE, but the webinar is open for suppliers as well to hear the discussion, to participate in discussion, and I think there's certainly the intent to encourage interaction between suppliers and researchers, so that can be a useful mechanism for that. For our panelists, is there any last comments that you want to make based on what's been discussed or asked? No, everyone seems to be happy. Jan?
Well, one last comment, tacking on to what you just said. So we as a consortium, obviously we have some reach into the community of these Earth observation researchers, but I'm guessing that the reach that you as the supplier collective have is way larger than what we can bring to bear. So the more you succeed in promoting these calls, the more likely it is that we will get interesting proposals, and that we'll actually be able to use this OCRE funding for the greater benefit of growing the Earth observation services market and the use of those services.
And a personal wish, the more we can move outside the EO research community into other domains of research and to build awareness and use of EO in those other domains, that would be, I think, a great result. Okay, well, thank you all very much. Thank you to OCRE for participating to this. Sorry, the screen's just changed. I hope everybody can still hear. It's to say the next EOcafe will be in 2 weeks' time. It's about women in Copernicus. In the meantime, if you go back to the previous slide, Natasha, if you have feedback on this this webinar, this EOcafe, we'd really like to hear from you, whether it's about facets of this meeting, the way it's worked, things that have been good or bad, or ideas that you'd like to hear picked up in the future at future EOcafes. We'd love to hear back from you. There is a Mentimeter, so the code is on the screen. Please provide us with a reply there. As I say, we're very happy to have your opinion. We will keep the room open if anyone wishes to remain. Though it's difficult with this this technology, I guess people will have to raise hands if they want to speak. Trust. Okay, so with that, thank you all very much, and have a good trip home, and see you in the next EOcafe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.